C'est dur parfois de raconter mon histoire et de vivre avec mes cicatrices. Parce que, à cause d'elles, je ne peux pas tout faire avec mes mains. Ils ont réussi à sauver certains doigts, mais pas tous. Mais c'est pas grave, je peux m'estimer heureuse d'avoir encore des doigts. Et d'avoir la peau que j'ai. Mon visage était si marqué, bien pire que maintenant. Quand les gens voient mes mains, ils se disent « Que lui est-il arrivé ?» C'est horrible de repenser à l'amour que j'ai eu pour lui. Parce qu'on ne peut pas croire que quelqu'un qu'on considère comme son meilleur ami puisse faire une chose pareille. Je ne peux pas, non. Pas ça. Je ne veux pas regarder ça. Cette photo est horrible. Elle me rappelle son visage quand il se mettait en colère contre moi. Il m'a tellement brisée pendant la période où on était ensemble. À un moment, peu m'importait de vivre ou de mourir. C'est une photo de moi juste avant la remise des diplômes, la fin du lycée. Et pas longtemps après ça, quelques mois, j'ai commencé à fréquenter Tracy. J'avais 18 ans, presque 19, une éternité. Et avec le recul, j'aimerais pouvoir être à nouveau cette personne. J'avais des projets. Je voulais devenir auxiliaire juridique. C'était mon objectif. Mais je ne suis pas allée aussi loin. Parce que j'ai rencontré Tracy. Il a donc clairement changé ma vie. C'était presque la fin de ma vie. Quand j'ai rencontré Tracy, c'était tout nouveau. C'était étourdissant. Quand on commence à sortir avec quelqu'un, c'est comme un objet tout neuf. On était aux antipodes l'un de l'autre. Lui, le mauvais garçon, et moi, la fille pieuse. C'était vraiment ça. Normalement, les garçons comme Tracy ne m'intéressaient pas. Mais il avait quelque chose qui m'attirait. C'était comme s'il se fichait de ce que pensaient les autres. L'attitude de Tracy aurait dû me repousser. Mais, allez savoir pourquoi, je me suis dit que je pouvais le faire changer. Il changera. Mais plus j'ai essayé, plus ça s'est aggravé. C'était violent. Une bombe prête à exploser. Au début de ma relation avec Tracy, on sortait souvent, au cinéma, etc. Mais le week-end, il avait toujours une excuse. On se voit ce week-end? Je ne peux pas sortir le week-end. Je me suis dit, ah bon? Pourquoi pas le week-end? Il prétextait à chaque fois qu'il devait faire quelque chose pour sa mère ou autre chose.
Ma mère a besoin d'aide, je peux pas.
C'est en rencontrant sa mère que je me suis rendu compte que ce n'était pas vrai. Et quand je l'ai pris en flagrant délit de mensonge, il a finalement avoué. Pourquoi tu ne me dis pas la vérité? Il passait ses week-ends en prison.
Je purge une peine au commissariat près de la bibliothèque.
Il avait volé de l'argent par effraction dans des kiosques à journaux, soi-disant pour payer son loyer. Il avait écopé de 30 week-ends. Il devait donc se présenter le vendredi et rester jusqu'au lundi matin. Étais-je contrarié qu'il ait fait ça? Oui. Étais-je fâché qu'il m'ait menti? Encore plus. Étais-je déçu d'avoir choisi quelqu'un comme ça? Au fond de moi, oui. Mais le cœur a ses raisons. Quand j'ai présenté Tracy à mes parents, ça a été quelque chose. Parce que je leur avais dit, quand vous le connaîtrez, vous l'aimerez. En pensant que Tracy se tiendrait bien. Mais c'était le cadet de ses soucis. Chaque fois que mon père abordait un sujet, Tracy le contredisait pour avoir le dernier mot. Il clamait haut et fort que mon père se trompait sur ce sujet, juste pour dire qu'il avait raison et mon père avait tort. C'était pénible à regarder. Et ça m'a rendue furieuse, parce que je me disais, « Tais-toi, Tracy. C'est pas censé se passer comme ça. Respecte mon père. »
Vous avez tort.
Au bout d'un moment, mon père m'a interdit de voir Tracy.
Sors de cette maison. Tout de suite.
J'ai dit, non, j'ai 18 ans. Tu ne m'interdiras pas de le voir. Je m'en vais. Et c'est ce que j'ai fait. Je suis partie. Ça a changé ma vie pour toujours. Aujourd'hui, quand j'y repense, ça me fait mal d'avoir choisi Tracy plutôt que mes parents. Maintenant que mon père est parti, si je pouvais revenir en arrière, j'agirais différemment. Je suppose qu'ils savaient que Tracy ne changerait pas, et ils avaient raison. Il n'a pas changé. Mon père connaissait des policiers, des juges, des enquêteurs. Alors, quand j'ai commencé à fréquenter Tracy, il a voulu en savoir plus sur lui. Qui est-il? Que fait-il? Quels sont ses antécédents? Mon père a vérifié tout ça. Et le casier judiciaire de Tracy était éloquent. C'était clair. Et mon père s'est dit, « Oh non, non, pas question. » Mon père et moi avions toujours été très proches et je pouvais lui parler de tout. Mais concernant Tracy, il ne voulait pas que je le voie. J'ai donc vécu chez diverses personnes tout en continuant à en sortir avec Tracy. Puis on a emménagé dans notre propre appartement. J'ai blessé mes parents en ne les écoutant pas. Je sais qu'ils ne voulaient que mon bien. J'étais en colère contre lui, furieuse. Je me suis dirigée vers ma voiture sur le parking. Il est venu à ma rencontre.
Mélanie!
Non, ne t'approche pas de moi. Dans ma tête, je me disais, je veux partir, sortir de ce parking et m'éloigner de lui. Je ne veux plus en entendre parler pour l'instant. Il était devant ma voiture, alors j'ai dit, dégage tout de suite. Laisse-moi passer. Il s'est alors approché de la portière, il l'a ouverte et l'a violemment claquée. Il y avait du verre partout. Dans ma voiture, sur le parking, partout. Il y avait mis une telle force. Ça m'a fait froid dans le dos. Je me suis dit, mais qu'est-ce que je fais? S'il peut briser la vitre d'une voiture en fermant la portière, ouvre les yeux. S'il est capable de faire ça, que peut-il faire d'autre? Cette photo est dure à regarder. Quand je vois cette photo de Tracy, je ne vois pas la personne dont je suis tombée amoureuse il y a des années. Je vois le mal incarné. C'est vraiment dur à regarder. Tout ce qui me vient à l'esprit, c'est pourquoi? Pourquoi l'ai-je choisi? J'ai épousé Tracy en pensant qu'on pourrait avoir la même relation que mes parents. Je pensais que je pourrais avoir ça avec Tracy. Bizarrement, malgré les épreuves qu'on avait déjà traversées. C'est pour ça que je l'ai épousée. Je croyais qu'on vivrait la même chose. J'étais convaincue de pouvoir le changer. Mais plus j'essayais, pire c'était. De pire en pire. Il finissait toujours par sortir de prison pour tous ses méfaits. Il se faisait taper sur les doigts. Et je me disais, allez, ça va changer. Avec un bébé, Tracy va vraiment changer. Il savait qu'il allait retourner en prison. Alors il m'a dit qu'il avait préparé la voiture et qu'on allait quitter l'État pour éviter de se présenter au tribunal. Autrement dit, je devais quitter ma famille juste après avoir accouché de ma fille. C'est la première fois que j'ai éprouvé de la haine pour lui. Ma mère était dans tous ses états. Elle a demandé à la police de lancer un avis de recherche. Elle ignorait ce qui se passait parce que je n'avais pas eu le temps de prévenir qui que ce soit. J'avais peur pour ma fille et aussi pour moi. Parce que je ne savais pas ce qui nous attendait. Je me disais, est-ce qu'il refuse de changer ou est-ce qu'il s'en fiche d'être maintenant père de famille? Est-ce que quelque chose peut changer cet homme? Et puis, au bout de 8 jours, je lui ai dit, soit tu me ramènes au Kentucky, soit j'y retourne seule. Il a accepté de revenir. Quand on est revenu, ma fille devait avoir 10 jours. Tracy a été arrêtée et peu de temps après, ils l'ont libérée sous caution. Il a promis de changer. Et je voulais tellement que ça marche entre nous que je n'ai pas vu le danger venir. Un jour, on s'est disputé parce qu'il avait perdu son travail.
Ils m'ont pris en grippe. J'ai rien fait de mal.
Bien sûr que si! Je m'apprêtais à partir au travail et il en a remis une couche. Moi, je voulais qu'on s'arrête là, mais il a continué à me contredire, et je ne voulais plus l'écouter.
T'as dit quoi, là?
Qu'est-ce que tu veux que j'y fasse? Alors que j'ouvrais la porte pour sortir, il m'a poussé. Mon bras a vrillé et il s'est cassé. J'ai eu très mal. J'ai entendu l'os craquer et je me suis dit, qu'est-ce qu'il vient de faire? Qu'est-ce qu'il vient de faire? J'ai dit, éloigne-toi de moi. Je crois que tu m'as cassé le bras. J'ai entendu un craquement. Il a dû penser que si j'allais à l'hôpital, il aurait des ennuis. J'ai dit, Tracy, je suis blessée. Laisse-moi aller à l'hôpital. Mais si tu y vas, dis-leur que t'es tombé.
Reste fidèle à cette version.
Quand je suis arrivée à l'hôpital et qu'on m'a prise en charge, je leur ai dit que j'étais tombée dans l'escalier. J'ai protégé Tracy. Voilà qu'il me battait, qu'il devenait violent. À ce stade de notre relation, j'ai donc commencé à avoir peur. J'avais trop peur pour partir. Je me suis sentie prisonnière de notre couple. Tracy pensait certainement qu'en instillant un sentiment de peur en moi, je resterais avec lui. Et il a réussi. Puis, quand j'ai commencé mon nouveau travail, un type venait tout le temps. Je connaissais son nom parce que c'était le frère d'un employé. Et il a commencé à en pincer pour moi. Il venait à l'heure de la fermeture et il s'attardait.
Mélanie?
Il me donnait vraiment la chair de poule. Puis, c'est devenu très délicat. J'étais stressée à cause de ce type qui venait toujours sur mon lieu de travail. Et ça ne s'est pas arrangé. Plus précisément, il me proposait qu'on sorte ensemble. Je disais non. Il recommençait, je disais non. Et c'était tous les jours, tout le temps. Je me disais, j'ai pas besoin de ça. Parce que j'essaye d'élever ma fille et de recoller les morceaux de mon mariage. Alors j'aimerais avoir une journée de travail normale, sans que ce type me tourne autour en permanence. Fatiguée de porter ce fardeau toute seule, j'ai décidé de raconter ce qu'il se passait à Tracy.
Allons-y, le moteur tourne.
Attends. Il a haussé les épaules, comme si ce n'était pas important. Tracy n'en avait rien à faire qu'on me harcèle. Ça m'a énormément perturbée parce que j'avais besoin qu'il y ait un réflexe de protection envers moi. Il n'a montré aucune émotion. C'était genre, ah, c'est ton problème. Ai-je été déçue? Oui. Blessée? Oui. Surprise? Non. J'avais toujours l'impression d'être suivie. En gros, je rentrais chez moi et le lendemain, ça recommençait. Jusqu'à ce que je fasse évacuer cet homme du magasin parce qu'il ne voulait pas partir. Pendant toute cette période, j'étais à fleur de peau. J'étais tout le temps sur le qui-vive. Et j'avais de bonnes raisons de l'être. Mais je ne me doutais pas que ça allait s'aggraver. Un soir, alors qu'on rentrait d'un barbecue organisé chez sa mère, on a découvert que les moustiquaires avaient été coupés. Et au moment où on s'est approché pour regarder ça de plus près, on a alors constaté que la fenêtre avait été calfeutrée. Quand on a vu ça, Tracy n'a pas réagi. Mais on a une fille qui vit ici. C'est quoi la suite? Mais ça ne lui faisait rien du tout. Et je ne comprenais pas du tout pourquoi. Il n'a pas proposé d'enlever le silicone ou d'acheter une nouvelle moustiquaire. Rien. Tout portait à croire que la personne avait agi par l'extérieur. Et c'est effrayant de se dire que quelqu'un puisse faire ça chez vous. Je me suis dit, ça doit être mon harceleur qui veut me punir d'avoir fait venir la police pour lui. Au moment de rentrer chez nous, je me sentais donc nerveuse. Puis, j'ai levé les yeux et j'ai vu que le détecteur de fumée n'était pas allumé. Je me suis dit, bon, les moustiquaires ont été découpés, la fenêtre calfeutrée, et le détecteur de fumée ne marche pas. Et c'est alors que j'ai vu que les fils du détecteur avaient été coupés. Quand j'ai vu que notre détecteur avait été coupé, j'ai tout de suite soupçonné le harceleur. Il était venu chez moi. J'étais choquée de savoir qu'une personne était entrée pour faire des choses comme désactiver le détecteur de fumée. J'ai décidé que je devais agir pour ma sécurité et celle de ma fille. J'ai alors poursuivi en justice le harceleur. Et le jour où je devais me rendre au procès, je me suis approchée de ma voiture. Et il y avait un mot dessus. J'ai eu peur de le lire, pour être honnête. Quand j'ai enfin eu le courage de le lire, c'était écrit « Si tu vas au tribunal demain, tu brûleras ». À ce moment-là, j'étais terrifiée. Je ne savais pas à quoi m'attendre ou à ne pas m'attendre. Il n'y avait plus aucune normalité dans ma vie. J'ai pensé qu'il cherchait à m'empêcher d'aller au tribunal. En fait, l'arrivée de ce harceleur a fait les affaires de Tracy. Tout s'est parfaitement mis en place. Un jour, j'ai éprouvé le besoin de parler à ma mère. Je sentais une menace imminente, mais sans pouvoir l'identifier. C'était un pressentiment. Je l'ai appelée 3 fois ce jour-là. Mes proches m'appellent Angel. Alors elle m'a dit « Angel, qu'est-ce qui ne va pas ?» J'ai répondu « Rien, maman. Je veux juste que tu saches que je t'aime. » Et je l'ai fait 3 fois. La 3e, elle m'a dit « Angel, qu'est-ce qu'il y a ?» Mais je ne voulais pas lui raconter tout ce que j'avais vécu. Alors j'ai dit « Rien, maman, ça va. Je veux que tu saches que je t'aime. » Mais elle a deviné à ma voix que ça n'allait vraiment pas. Je me sentais stressée ce soir-là. Alors Tracy m'a donné ce qu'il appelait des pilules de relaxation pour m'aider à dormir. D'habitude, on se couchait ensemble. Ce soir-là, il ne l'a pas fait, ce que j'ai trouvé bizarre. J'ai immédiatement sombré dans le sommeil. Ces pilules étaient très fortes. Ce dont je me souviens ensuite, c'est d'entendre un grand whoosh. J'ai ouvert les yeux et il y avait des flammes partout dans la chambre. La porte était le seul moyen de sortir de cette pièce. Alors je savais que je devais l'atteindre, même s'il y avait des flammes partout. Ma première pensée a été « Je dois sortir d'ici et sauver ma fille ». J'ai sauté du lit au milieu des flammes. Elles m'arrivaient alors à la taille, mais je m'en fichais. Quand je suis arrivée à la porte, j'ai voulu l'ouvrir. J'ai essayé, mais ça faisait comme un élastique. Elle s'ouvrait un peu, puis se refermait en claquant. Je ne comprenais pas pourquoi ça faisait ça. J'ai essayé un grand nombre de fois. Tracy! La poignée me brûlait, la peau des mains. Mais je continuais d'essayer, parce que je savais que c'était la seule issue. Tracy! Tracy! Quand j'ai crié son nom, le suppliant de m'aider, suppliant Tracy de m'aider, tout ce qu'il m'a dit, et je me souviens clairement de ces mots, c'était « Sors de la même façon que t'es entré ». Quand j'ai compris qu'il ne m'aiderait pas, j'ai couru jusqu'au téléphone. Tracy était en train d'appeler les secours pour couvrir ses traces. C'était comme une mise en scène téléphonique, si je puis dire. Il disait « Dépêchez-vous, ma femme est en feu ». Alors j'ai crié « À l'aide! À l'aide! À l'aide !» Et l'opérateur a dit « Madame, pouvez-vous sortir ?» J'arrivais juste à dire « Non, je ne peux pas !» Je n'arrivais pas à me faire comprendre. Je me suis dit « Bon, je vais mourir ici. Personne ne va venir. Je ne vois plus rien. C'est tout noir. » Je me suis dit « Je ne vais jamais m'en sortir. » Je me suis recroquevillée en attendant la mort. J'étais en position fétale. Mes vêtements avaient fondu sur ma peau. Il y avait du sang partout et... J'ai prié, « Seigneur, sors-moi d'ici. Sors-moi d'ici ou laisse-moi mourir. » Parce que ça faisait si mal, à tel point que j'ai fini par ne plus rien sentir. Ça m'a semblé durer une éternité. Mais juste après avoir prié qu'on me sorte de là, ou qu'on me laisse mourir, j'ai entendu mon voisin appeler mon nom.
Mélanie! Mélanie, tu es là?
Je me suis dit, je vais sortir d'ici. Et c'était une sorte de miracle, à défaut d'autres mots. Pour moi, c'en était un. Je suis retournée vers la porte et elle était ouverte. J'ai tout de suite traversé le couloir pour sauver ma fille. Mais il l'avait déjà évacuée. Je suis sortie et les pompiers sont arrivés. Quand ils m'ont vue, ils ont dit « Il va falloir les litreiller. On ne peut rien faire. » On m'a mise dans un hélicoptère et pendant tout le vol, j'ai entendu « On la perd. On la perd. » Je me souviens, entre deux pertes de connaissance, d'une lumière vive. Et je me suis dit « Ça va aller maintenant. Ça va aller. » Puis, je suis tombée dans le coma.
T'es sûre que t'es prête pour ça?
Pas vraiment, mais je vais le faire.
Ok.
Votre nom, s'il vous plaît. Monsieur?
Venez aider ma femme. Il y a le feu dans la chambre.
Oui, votre nom et votre adresse complète, s'il vous plaît.
Elle va mourir.
Votre nom et votre adresse.
Dépêchez-vous, je vous en prie.
Monsieur, il est important que vous me donniez votre nom et votre adresse.
Faites vite, elle va mourir!
Entendre ça, ça fait tout remonter. Ça me ramène dans cette chambre. C'est comme si je ressentais à nouveau les flammes et tout ce qui se passe dans cette pièce. Les flammes au niveau de ma taille, mais aussi la panique. Je griffe pour essayer d'en sortir. Je ne peux plus respirer. Je comprends que c'est lui. Tout remonte. Vouloir sauver ma fille. Traverser le couloir pour l'atteindre. C'était mon but. Peu importe la douleur. Ma fille de 4 ans comptait sur sa maman, alors je devais être là pour elle.
Je me souviens avoir dit que j'avais vu mon père dans le couloir. Puis un grand flash qui m'avait effrayée. Et je crois que si je ne m'étais pas mise à crier, il ne m'aurait pas prise avec lui. On a alors traversé le parking en courant. On entendait maman depuis l'appartement. Je lui ai alors demandé où elle était. Et je me souviens qu'il ne m'a pas pris la main pour me consoler. Il m'a juste regardé et il a dit « Elle n'est plus là, il n'y a plus que nous ». Et c'est certainement le dernier souvenir que j'ai de mon père.
Quand j'étais dans le coma, j'étais paralysée à partir du cou. C'était très bizarre. C'était comme si j'avais un gros livre au-dessus de ma tête qui racontait l'histoire de ce qui avait mené à l'incendie et des choses qu'il avait faites et que j'aurais dû voir. Le harceleur n'y était pour rien. Tracy avait tout manigancé. Le calfeutrage de la fenêtre, les moustiquaires découpés depuis l'intérieur, Tracy. Les fils du détecteur de fumée, Tracy. Sans compter le mot que Tracy avait écrit de sa propre main en se faisant passer pour le harceleur. L'homme en qui j'avais eu tant confiance avait fait tout ça dans le but de me tuer. Plus tard, j'ai appris combien il aurait touché si j'étais morte. Il y avait 375 000 $ d'assurance vie sur moi. Et je me suis dit, c'est ça que je vaux. Genre, c'est ce que je vaux pour lui. C'était comme un film d'horreur qu'on voit à la télé. Ces choses-là n'arrivent jamais. Mais ça m'est arrivé. Et j'avais juste envie de pleurer. Parce que je me disais, pourquoi ne l'ai-je pas vu? Pourquoi? Quand j'étais dans le coma, je me souviens très vaguement être persuadée d'avoir senti que Tracy était entrée dans ma chambre. Et je vais fermer les yeux pour tenter de revivre ce moment. Dans le coma, c'était comme si mon ouïe était plus développée. J'ai su que Tracy était dans la pièce parce qu'il est entré en sifflotant et c'était sa façon de siffler. Ça sonnait toujours faux, alors j'ai su qui c'était. À ce moment-là, je me suis figée. J'attendais de voir ce qu'il allait faire. Il avait déjà fait ce qu'on sait, à savoir m'immoler. Quelle serait la suite? J'ai commencé à craindre pour ma vie, ou ce qu'il en restait. J'ai des frissons en pensant à ce que j'ai ressenti quand j'étais dans le coma, en sachant qu'il était là. Je savais que je ne pourrais rien faire s'il essayait de m'étouffer. Alors je me suis figée. En panique, je me fige et j'écoute. Là, je l'entends dire « Voilà ». J'ai pas fini le travail, mais je viens pour ça. Alors je me suis dit, oh non, il va me tuer, il va m'achever. Puis je l'entends débrancher des choses. Et là, je commence à manquer de souffle parce que je suis sous assistance respiratoire. Et il continue à siffloter en faisant ça. Et je me dis, est-ce que quelqu'un va venir? Je ne peux plus respirer. Et au moment où ça devient vraiment critique, j'entends les infirmières se précipiter pour voir ce qui se passe.
Non! Qu'est-ce que vous faites?
Elles étaient furieuses. J'ignore ce qui s'est passé hors de ma chambre. Mais il n'y a jamais remis les pieds. Plus tard, j'ai appris que, comme il avait clairement voulu débrancher mes machines, un policier avait été placé devant ma porte. J'ai insisté. J'avais besoin de voir ma fille. Mais pour cette petite de 4 ans, qui jetait des coups d'œil furtifs à travers les jambes de son grand-père, pour voir cette personne censée être sa mère, ça a été horrible. Si elle se cachait, c'est parce que mon apparence l'effrayait. Je n'avais plus le même visage. Elle est devenue toute pâle. Mes mains lui étaient étrangères. Mes cheveux avaient été coupés très courts. Je ne ressemblais donc plus à sa maman. Et elle est devenue blanche comme un linge. L'enfant que j'avais mis au monde ne me connaissait plus. Alors, en sortant du coma, devoir m'accrocher à la vie pour elle et accepter le fait que j'allais devoir renouer le contact avec ma fille depuis le début, c'était... Ça m'a rendue furieuse. Vraiment. Parce que ça n'aurait jamais dû arriver. Je devais la convaincre que j'étais là, que je n'étais pas morte. Ça va aller. Maman a survécu. Quand je suis sortie du coma et que les enquêteurs m'ont interrogée, ma fille a commencé à me raconter certaines choses qu'elle avait vues cette nuit-là. Et ça m'a fait mal, parce que personne ne veut que son enfant, quel que soit son âge, même adulte, vive l'expérience de voir son père biologique faire une chose pareille à sa maman, sa propre femme. Comment expliquer à un enfant pourquoi quelqu'un ferait ça? À 4 ans. Comment lui expliquer? C'est impossible. À part dire que cette personne était méchante. Une mauvaise personne. Après avoir disposé des draps attachés ensemble autour de mon lit, il a versé de l'essence dessus. Puis il a relié la porte de la chambre à celle de la salle de bain avec des tendeurs. Ils ont parlé d'une tentative de meurtre. Et quand j'ai entendu ces mots, ça m'a secoué jusqu'à la moelle. Il y a des moments où, encore aujourd'hui, je suis terrifiée. Quand j'entends une sirène de pompiers, quand quelqu'un allume un feu de joie, quand j'entends un détecteur de fumée, toutes ces petites choses me ramènent à la nuit de l'incendie. Les flammes qui m'ont sauté au visage quand je dormais, la puissante explosion que j'ai entendue, ça me donne envie de courir le plus loin possible. Mais je ne peux pas, parce que ce n'est plus là. Et je dois souvent me le répéter, tu n'es plus là-bas. Je ne suis pas une victime. Je suis une rescapée. Plus les médecins me disaient que je ne pouvais pas faire telle ou telle chose, plus ça me donnait la volonté de leur prouver que j'allais marcher, me servir de mes mains, conduire. Je conduis une voiture. C'est fou, non? Et être en mesure, après tout ça, de continuer à élever ma fille. Je remercie le ciel chaque jour de la voir. Elle sait que sans elle, je ne me serais pas accrochée à la vie. Elle a dû traverser tant d'épreuves qu'elle n'aurait jamais dû subir. Je ne peux pas revenir en arrière, mais je peux préparer l'avenir et vivre le présent. Et je peux lui promettre que je serai toujours là pour elle. Et je lui dirai chaque jour que je suis désolée qu'elle ait dû subir tout ça. Je n'aurais jamais cru avoir cette vie aujourd'hui, parce qu'il y avait tellement d'obstacles en travers de ma route. Déjà, qui voudrait d'une personne balafrée de partout comme moi? Et mon nouveau mari m'a toujours traitée comme une personne normale. On se fréquentait depuis moins d'1 an quand il m'a demandé en mariage. Et on est mariés depuis 25 ans. C'est mon meilleur ami.
The phone rang after midnight, the kind of sound that cuts through sleep like a blade, sharp and unwelcome, and in Michigan in 1993, that sound carried a weight no one recognized yet, a vibration traveling through copper wire and darkness, about to wake a case that had been buried under dust, doubt, and years of silence. Outside, the streets were empty, storefronts dark, snow pushed into gray piles along the curb, and somewhere in a quiet house a light flicked on as a man reached for the receiver, unaware that this single moment would eventually redraw the outline of a crime that had never truly gone away. The night air back then had a particular smell, cold metal and exhaust, the kind that clung to clothes and lingered in memory. Michigan was still trying to find its footing in the early 90s. Factories were closing. Neighborhoods were thinning out. People learned to mind their own business, to lock their doors, to keep their heads down. It was in this atmosphere that the disappearance happened, sudden and wrong, like a door slamming in an otherwise quiet hallway. She was last seen on a weekday evening, nothing remarkable about it at first glance. No dramatic goodbye. No sense of finality. Just routine movements, a familiar route, a promise to be back soon. The kind of ordinary moment that only becomes sacred once it's gone. When she didn't return, concern arrived slowly. Then all at once, flooding kitchens and living rooms with panic that tasted metallic on the tongue. By morning, whispers had already started. A missing woman. A car found parked where it shouldn't be. Purse still inside. Cold case headlines didn't exist yet, not officially, but the community felt the chill immediately. Police lights cut through the dawn, red and blue reflections bouncing off frost-covered windows as officers knocked on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Did you see her? Did you hear anything? Did anything seem out of place? The first days were chaos disguised as order. Search teams moved through fields and wooded lots, boots crunching over frozen ground. Helicopters traced slow arcs overhead. Volunteers passed out flyers printed on cheap paper, her face already beginning to separate from the life behind it, becoming an image, an icon of absence. Every hour without answers thickened the air, made breathing feel like work. Investigators worked the case hard at first. They always did. They retraced her steps, mapped her last known movements, interviewed coworkers, neighbors, anyone who might have crossed her path. They followed up on tips that led nowhere, chased rumors that dissolved under scrutiny. A stranger seen at a gas station. A van idling too long on a side street. Each lead promised clarity, then delivered only more questions. The crime scene, if it could even be called that, refused to speak. There was no blood, no obvious sign of struggle, nothing that pointed decisively in one direction. The car offered little beyond fingerprints that could belong to anyone and fibers too common to matter. Evidence bags filled shelves, but none of it screamed for attention. It all whispered, and the whispers contradicted each other. As days stretched into weeks, the tone shifted. Urgency gave way to procedure. Press conferences became shorter, more guarded. Words like ongoing investigation and persons of interest floated through the air without anchoring themselves to anything solid. The community watched closely, reading between lines, searching for meaning in the pauses between sentences. Her family lived in a state of suspended time. Every ring of the phone, every knock at the door sent their hearts racing. They slept in short, shallow bursts, waking to the same thought again and again. Where is she? The question hollowed them out, made the house feel too big and too small at the same time. They replayed her last day endlessly, looking for a missed signal, a warning they might have ignored. Months passed. The seasons turned. Snow melted into mud, mud into grass. New stories replaced old ones in the local news. The missing woman's face slid from the front page to the inside, then disappeared altogether. The investigation slowed, not because anyone wanted it to, but because there were only so many times you could knock on the same doors, ask the same questions, hope for a different answer. Inside the police department, the case file grew thicker but colder. Notes yellowed. Evidence was boxed and labeled, then moved to storage. Detectives were reassigned. New cases arrived, loud and immediate, demanding attention with fresh bodies and clear timelines. The unsolved one lingered in the background, a quiet accusation no one knew how to answer. Cold case. The term wasn't used yet, but the reality was there. A crime unresolved, a life unaccounted for. A community left with a wound that never quite healed. People stopped talking about it openly, but they didn't forget. They couldn't. Every time a similar car drove by, every time a woman didn't make it home on time, the memory flared back to life. Years slipped by almost unnoticed. Children grew up. Stores closed. New ones opened. The missing woman became a story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale parents shared with daughters, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. Her name surfaced occasionally, usually around anniversaries, then sank back into silence. Inside the evidence room, boxes sat untouched. Technology marched forward outside those walls, but inside time stood still. DNA analysis was still crude, databases incomplete. What had been collected in 1993 waited patiently, unaware that it would one day speak louder than any witness ever could. Detectives who had worked the case carried it with them. Some retired. Some transferred. Some passed away. The unanswered questions followed them, an invisible weight pressing down during quiet moments. They wondered what they had missed, what they could have done differently, whether the answer had slipped through their fingers while they were looking somewhere else. Then came the call. Years later. Long after midnight. A voice on the other end that didn't belong to the past, but reached into it anyway. It wasn't dramatic. No confession. Just information. A detail that didn't fit. A name mentioned casually, almost reluctantly. The kind of tip that could have been dismissed on any other night but wasn't. The detective who took it felt something shift. A subtle tightening in the chest. He'd heard hundreds of tips over the years. Most were useless. Some were cruel. This one was different. Not because of what was said but how it was said. The hesitation. The familiarity. The sense that the caller was fighting with themselves just to stay on the line. Notes were taken. Times logged. The call ended, leaving behind a silence that felt charged, electric. The detective stared at the wall for a long moment, listening to the hum of the building, the distant sound of traffic. He knew better than to hope. But he also knew when something refused to let go. The next morning the old file came out of storage. Dust rose as the box was opened, particles catching the light like tiny ghosts. Inside were photographs, reports, transcripts, fragments of a story interrupted. The detective spread them out, reading with fresh eyes, guided now by a detail that hadn't existed before. Patterns began to suggest themselves. Small inconsistencies that once seemed insignificant now stood out sharply. A timeline that didn't quite line up. A person mentioned briefly, then forgotten. A lead that had gone cold not because it was wrong, but because it was early. The cold case stirred, stretching after years of enforced sleep. It wasn't solved. Not yet. But it was awake. And as the detective worked through the night, the sense grew stronger that the past had not been finished speaking. That somewhere buried beneath decades of silence, the truth had been waiting for the right moment. The right voice, the right call after midnight to bring it back into the light. Outside the city moved on unaware. Cars passed. Lights flicked on and off. But inside that small office time folded in on itself, 1993 bleeding into the present, and the long shadow of an unresolved crime began to sharpen, preparing to fall once more across a community that thought it had already learned how to live without answers. The files smelled like old paper and neglect, a dry, almost sweet odor that clung to the fingertips as pages were turned slowly, deliberately, each one a reminder of how much had been said without ever being concluded. The detective sat alone under fluorescent light, the rest of the building asleep, reading reports written by men who had long since moved on or grown old, their words frozen in time like footprints in wet cement. Dates jumped out first, names next, and then the gaps, wide, uncomfortable stretches where nothing concrete had ever filled the space. The late-night tip echoed in his head, not as a voice anymore but as a pressure, a nudge that kept steering his attention toward the same few details. A name mentioned once, maybe twice, never circled, never underlined. Just there. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Back in 1993 it had meant nothing. Now it felt heavier, as if time itself had added weight to it. He pulled the original timeline closer. The last confirmed sighting. The time the car was found. The window between those two moments yawned open like a dark corridor. Poorly lit. Full of places someone could step in and disappear. In that window, investigators had once chased dozens of possibilities. Now, with fresh perspective, most of them collapsed into noise. What remained was unsettlingly simple. The missing woman had trusted routine. Same roads. Same habits. Same expectations. That predictability had once made her easier to look for. It might also have made her easier to find, for the wrong person. The detective traced her route with his finger, visualizing it street by street, intersection by intersection. Somewhere along that line something had gone wrong. Somewhere familiar had turned hostile. He reached for the evidence inventory, flipping past items that had gone nowhere. Fibers. Tire impressions. Partial prints. Then he stopped. A small notation, almost an afterthought. Biological material recovered from the vehicle. At the time it had been logged, tested with the limited tools available, and set aside. No match. No follow-up. No miracle. In 1993 DNA had been a promise, not a solution. Samples were compared manually, databases sparse, technology slow and expensive. What didn't speak clearly back then was often shelved, not out of neglect but necessity. Now, decades later, the same evidence felt like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. The detective leaned back, exhaling slowly. Reopening a cold case wasn't just about revisiting old ground. It was about risking disappointment all over again. He'd seen it before. Hope flaring bright, then burning out, leaving behind something even colder than before. But this time something felt different. The tip hadn't pointed vaguely outward. It pointed inward, toward the case itself, toward what had already been collected and forgotten. By morning the building came back to life. Coffee brewed. Radios crackled. Desks filled. The detective briefed his supervisor quietly, carefully, choosing words that balanced caution with urgency. Cold cases had a way of draining resources if handled recklessly. He needed permission, not excitement. He got it. The evidence box was retrieved from storage and transferred to a lab equipped with technology that didn't exist when the crime happened. Chain of custody forms were signed, logged, double-checked. Everything moved slowly, deliberately, as if everyone involved understood the fragility of the moment. One mistake, one oversight, and the past would slam shut again. While the lab worked, the detective turned to people. Names from the file resurfaced, many followed by notes like uncooperative, no longer in area, deceased. Time had thinned the list, but it had also stripped away distractions. Those who remained were re-interviewed, not with the urgency of a fresh disappearance, but with the gravity of unfinished business. Some were surprised to be contacted at all. Others reacted defensively, irritation masking something harder to define. A few spoke freely, relieved, almost eager to unload memories they had carried for years without knowing where to put them. Stories overlapped. Timelines blurred. But small consistencies began to emerge, aligning with the detail from the late-night call. The name came up again. Casually. Always on the edge of conversations, never the focus. Someone who had been around. Someone who knew the area. Someone who fit, not dramatically but quietly. The kind of fit that didn't raise alarms until it was seen from the right angle. As interviews continued, the detective felt the strange pull of déjà vu. These questions had been asked before. These answers given before. But context changed everything. What once sounded harmless now carried undertones. What once felt irrelevant now demanded explanation. The past wasn't changing. The lens was. The lab called in the afternoon. No conclusions yet, but confirmation that the sample was viable. More than that, it was clean enough to run through modern databases. The detective closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment settle. This was the fork in the road. Either the evidence would finally speak, or it would confirm cruelly that even time and technology had limits. As days passed, anticipation crept in despite efforts to suppress it. The case began to ripple outward quietly. A few trusted colleagues were looped in. A cold case unit meeting was scheduled. Files were duplicated. The investigation had momentum now, the kind that was impossible to fake. Then came the first result. Not a match. Not yet. But close. Partial hit. Familial DNA. A distant relative somewhere in the system. Enough to point, not enough to accuse. It was like seeing a silhouette through fog, no features but unmistakably human. The detective stared at the report, pulse steady but insistent. This was more than the case had ever had before. A direction. A narrowing. The family tree was mapped carefully, branching outward, names populating the page like a slow-growing organism. Some branches dead-ended quickly. Others led back toward familiar ground. There it was again. The same name. This time not floating loosely in witness statements, but anchored by blood, by probability, by science. The distance between suspicion and evidence shrank abruptly, and with it came a weight that pressed down on everyone involved. Surveillance began quietly. Records were pulled. Employment histories. Address changes. Traffic stops. Nothing overtly incriminating. No obvious red flags. Just a life lived mostly under the radar. The kind of life that doesn't attract attention until attention is unavoidable. The detective watched from afar, careful not to rush. Cold cases punish impatience. Every move had to be clean, defensible, documented. If this was going where it seemed to be going, there would be no second chance. Meanwhile, the community remained unaware. To them, the case was still a ghost story, a tragedy from another era. No press releases. No statements. Just quiet work happening behind closed doors. The detective preferred it that way. Truth didn't need an audience until it was ready to stand on its own. Late one evening, alone again in the office, he laid out the pieces across his desk. The timeline, the interviews, the DNA report, the tip that had started it all. He saw now how they connected, not neatly, not cleanly, but undeniably. The picture was incomplete, but its shape was unmistakable. The cold case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just unresolved. It was active, alive, dangerous in the way truth can be when it's been denied for too long. Somewhere, someone who believed they had outrun the past was about to discover that time doesn't erase evidence, preserves it. Outside, night settled over the city once more. Lights glowed in windows. Cars moved steadily along familiar roads. Life continued, unaware that the ground beneath it was shifting. The detective shut off his desk lamp, leaving the file open, its pages catching the faint ambient light. The past had finally found its voice, and it was only just beginning to speak. The knock came earlier than expected, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the low hum of the office like a gunshot in a quiet room. The detective looked up from the file, already knowing this wasn't casual. The lab supervisor stepped in without waiting for an invitation, face unreadable, eyes carrying the kind of weight that only comes with confirmation. Not suspicion, not possibility, confirmation. The updated DNA report landed on the desk with a muted thud. Pages thicker than before. Charts. Percentages. A lineage narrowed to a point so fine it almost felt unreal. The familial match had been refined, cross-referenced, stripped of uncertainty. What had once been a silhouette now had a spine, shoulders, a recognizable outline. A single individual sat at the center of it all, no longer protected by probability. The name was typed cleanly at the top of the page. No bold, no highlights, just ink and certainty. The detective didn't react right away. Years of working cold cases had taught him restraint. This was the moment where mistakes were most often made, when emotion rushed in to claim credit before procedure could secure the ground. He read every line, every footnote, every margin comment. He traced the logic backward, looking for cracks. There were none. The sample from the car, the modern database, the familial link, the direct comparison from a legally obtained reference. It aligned too perfectly to argue with. The past had finally caught up to the present. Outside the office, the department moved at its usual pace. Phones rang. Officers laughed. Someone complained about the coffee. None of them knew that a 1993 cold case had just shifted from dormant to explosive. The detective gathered the core team quietly, choosing each person with care. Too many voices created leaks. Too few created blind spots. The suspect's profile was laid out on the table. Not a monster on paper. Not a career criminal. A man who had drifted through jobs, relationships, cities. Minor run-ins with the law. Nothing violent on record. The kind of background that makes juries uncomfortable later, because it forces them to confront a truth they don't like. Evil doesn't always announce itself. They reconstructed his movements from the early 90s, a task made harder by time but not impossible. Old pay stubs, utility bills, a driver's license address that placed him uncomfortably close to the victim's route. He hadn't been a stranger. He had been part of the background noise of her life, someone she might have seen without ever really seeing. Witness statements from decades ago were reread with fresh eyes. One line, once dismissed as vague, now glowed like a warning light. A neighbor mentioning a man lingering near the street. A coworker recalling an offhand comment about someone creepy but harmless. Words like that age poorly. Harmless is often a conclusion people reach too quickly, just to make sense of unease. Surveillance shifted from passive to active. Unmarked cars. Long lenses. Routine patterns mapped and memorized. The suspect moved through his days unaware, his life continuing as it always had. Grocery store. Gas station. A short walk in the evening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious. And yet every step felt charged now, heavy with the knowledge of what lay beneath. The detective felt the familiar tension settle in his chest. This was the dangerous part. When evidence said one thing but the human brain still searched for excuses for alternatives. 30 years was a long time to carry a secret. But secrets don't decay. They harden. An interview was planned, carefully staged. Not an arrest. Not yet. Just a conversation. The kind designed to observe reactions, to test narratives, to see whether time had made the suspect careless or cautious. The room was prepared with precision. Neutral colors. No intimidation. Cameras rolling quietly. When the man walked in, he looked older than his file photo suggested. Time had bent him but not broken him. His hands shook slightly as he sat, though he smiled easily, the practiced expression of someone used to keeping things surface level. He answered questions politely. Where he'd lived, what he'd done for work, whether he remembered the victim. He did. Not vividly, not emotionally, just enough to be believable, just enough to avoid suspicion. The detective listened more than he spoke, letting silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. People reveal more in the gaps than in their words. The suspect filled some of those gaps with small talk, jokes that landed flat. His eyes darted to the camera once, then away. When the conversation turned to 1993, his posture changed. Subtle. A tightening of the shoulders. Pause half a second too long. Not enough to accuse. Enough to note. The detective asked about the area where the car had been found. The suspect shrugged, said he'd driven those roads 100 times. Who hadn't? Then came the moment carefully chosen. Question about DNA. The suspect's smile faltered. Just briefly. But the room felt it. His breathing shifted. He asked what kind of DNA. A curious question. Too specific. The detective watched as the man recalibrated, trying to catch up to a reality he hadn't expected to face. The interview ended without confrontation. No accusations. No revelations. Just a handshake and a polite goodbye. The suspect walked out believing he had done well. Believing the past had stayed buried. He was wrong. Back in the office, the team dissected every second of footage. Micro-expressions. Verbal slips. Patterns of avoidance. It wasn't a confession, but it was consistent with someone who knew more than he admitted. Combined with the DNA, it was enough to move forward. A warrant was requested, reviewed, challenged, approved. The arrest was planned for early morning, the time when resistance is lowest and surprises are hardest to mask. Officers approached quietly, lights off, radios silent. The suspect answered the door in a robe, confusion etched across his face. The words were spoken calmly, professionally. He was placed in handcuffs without incident. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, unaware they were witnessing the collapse of a lie that had stood for decades. To them, it looked like any other arrest. To the detectives, it was history shifting under their feet. At the station, the interrogation room felt heavier than usual. The suspect sat across from the detective, no longer smiling. His eyes were sharp now, calculating. He asked for a lawyer. The request was honored. Silence filled the room, thick and final. Evidence continued to stack. Additional samples. Old items re-examined. Tiny threads woven into a rope strong enough to hold in court. The case file grew, pages replacing doubt with structure, chaos with clarity. News of the arrest was kept quiet for as long as possible, but whispers leaked as they always do. A reporter made a call. Then another. The phrase cold case resurfaced, creeping back into public consciousness like a memory people didn't realize they still carried. Families of the victim were notified privately, carefully, with compassion sharpened by years of uncertainty. Tears came, but so did something else, relief edged with grief, a complicated emotion that didn't fit neatly into words. Answers don't heal everything, but they stop the bleeding. As night fell, the detective returned to his desk, alone again. The same fluorescent lights. The same quiet. But the file no longer felt stagnant. It felt alive, volatile, like something that could finally move forward. He thought about the late-night tip, the anonymous voice that had cracked the door open. He thought about the decades that had passed, about how close the truth had been all along. Justice, he knew, wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But sometimes if you waited long enough, it arrived anyway. The cold case had entered its final act. And for the first time since 1993, the ending was no longer a mystery. The announcement didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. It arrived as a single line buried halfway down the morning news cycle, then exploded outward, ricocheting through radios, phones, and kitchen tables across the state. Michigan 1993 cold case solved. Suspect in custody after late-night tip. The words looked unreal, like a headline pulled from another decade and pasted clumsily into the present. For years, the case had been a ghost story, whispered whenever someone drove that stretch of road after dark. Now it had a pulse again, and the community felt it immediately. At the station, the mood shifted from cautious satisfaction to controlled urgency. An arrest was only the beginning. The real work started now. Prosecutors were looped in, their questions sharp and relentless. They didn't care about instincts or intuition. They wanted chains. Unbroken. Evidence that could survive a courtroom designed to tear narratives apart. Every document from 1993 was pulled again. Boxes reopened. Tape his filling rooms as old interviews were replayed for the 100th time. Details once overlooked were now magnified under the harsh light of relevance. The suspect sat in a holding cell, hours stretching into an uneasy limbo. His attorney arrived mid-morning, expression already hardened, briefcase heavy with strategies. The request was immediate. No more questions, no interviews, no cooperation. Silence became the official stance. The detective expected it. Confessions were rare in cases like this. Time didn't soften guilt. It fossilized it. Still, the team pushed forward. They revisited the victim's last known hours, reconstructing them minute by minute. Not for the first time, but this time with an endpoint in sight. Her movements that day had been painfully ordinary. A stop at work. A call to a friend. A plan to be home before dark. Ordinary routines that now felt like fragile glass, shattered by what followed. The road where her car was found was revisited again. Cameras documenting every angle. The trees were taller now. The asphalt repaved. But the curve in the road remained the same, the place where something had gone wrong, where fear had likely flared for a brief, desperate moment. Detectives stood there in silence, imagining the night air of 1993, the absence of witnesses, the suddenness of violence. Crimes don't need spectators to be real. They only need opportunity. Back at the lab, technicians worked methodically, confirming what had already been confirmed. Defense teams thrive on doubt. The word contamination lurks like a weapon. So every sample was rechecked, every transfer documented, every result verified by independent analysts. The DNA didn't waver. It told the same story every time, indifferent to human resistance. The suspect's past was peeled open layer by layer. Former coworkers were contacted. Ex-partners tracked down. Some conversations ended quickly, people reluctant to reopen memories they had neatly sealed. Others lingered, voices lowering as they spoke about moments that had never quite made sense. A temper glimpsed and dismissed. A sudden move. A relationship that ended without explanation. Individually, they meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that felt disturbingly coherent. The media pressure intensified. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, speculating wildly. Some called it closure. Others called it too late. Online forums erupted. Armchair detectives dissecting timelines, arguing guilt before a single word was spoken in court. The victim's name trended briefly, then sank beneath the noise, just another story competing for attention. For her family, the attention was both validation and invasion, a reminder that their private grief had always been public property. The detective avoided the noise as much as possible. He had learned early in his career that headlines fade faster than consequences. What mattered was the room he now stood in with the prosecutor, walls lined with boards covered in photos, maps, and strings. This wasn't theater. This was strategy. They spoke in measured tones, debating which pieces to introduce first, how to guide a jury through decades without losing them to confusion or fatigue. The defense filed motions almost immediately. Suppress the DNA. Question the chain of custody. Argue prejudice due to time. Each motion was expected. Each one answered with documentation so thorough it bordered on obsessive. The case had waited 30 years. It could withstand delays. Meanwhile, the suspect adjusted to confinement with visible discomfort. Guards noted his restlessness, his habit of pacing until lights out. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was to ask procedural questions. How long before bail? When court would be? What charges were officially filed? He avoided the word murder, as if not naming it could still keep it distant. One afternoon, as paperwork was finalized, the detective received a call he hadn't expected. Another tip. Not anonymous this time. A man claiming he'd known the suspect back in the early 90s, remembered a night when he'd come home shaken, hands scratched, clothes smelling of dirt and sweat. At the time it had been brushed off as a bar fight. Now the memory carried weight. A formal statement was taken, recorded carefully, added to the growing file. The past kept offering fragments, as if finally ready to speak. The courtroom appearance came weeks later. The suspect stood as charges were read, his face expressionless, eyes fixed on a spot just above the judge's head. First-degree murder. The words landed heavily, echoing in the quiet room. The victim's family sat behind the prosecution, hands clasped, breathing shallow. This wasn't justice yet, but it was acknowledgement. Outside, microphones crowded the steps. Statements were made, carefully worded. No triumph, no promises, just a recognition of persistence, of science catching up to secrecy. The phrase cold case was repeated again and again, stripped of its weight through repetition. Inside the building, the reality remained heavy, unresolved. As days turned into weeks, preparation consumed everything. Jury consultants weighed in. Visual exhibits were refined. Timelines were simplified without losing integrity. The goal was clarity. To take a story scattered across 3 decades and present it as a single undeniable arc. Late one evening, the detective returned to the evidence room alone. He pulled the original box one more time, running his fingers along its edges. He thought about the night it had been sealed, the officers who'd believed they'd done enough, the ones who'd quietly wondered if they ever would. Cold cases don't fail because people don't care. They fail because answers hide well. He closed the box gently, knowing it would soon be opened again. This time in front of 12 strangers tasked with deciding what the truth meant. Outside, the city settled into sleep, unaware of the tension humming beneath its streets. The case was no longer frozen. It was moving, accelerating toward a moment that couldn't be stopped. And somewhere between the evidence, the memories, and the long-delayed reckoning, the past was finally being forced to account for itself. The first day of pretrial hearings arrived without ceremony, but everyone inside the courthouse could feel the gravity pressing down like a change in air pressure before a storm. Hallways echoed differently when a case this old came back to life. Footsteps sounded louder. Voices dropped instinctively. A 30-year silence was being challenged, and not everyone believed it should be. The defense moved first, as expected. Their argument was simple, rehearsed, and delivered with calm precision. Time had poisoned the truth. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Witnesses reinterpret their own pasts through the lens of headlines. They spoke of unfair prejudice, of a man being judged not for what could be proven, but for what people wanted to believe after decades of unanswered questions. The word cold case was weaponized, reframed as a liability rather than a triumph. The prosecution listened without interruption. When their turn came, they didn't raise their voices. They didn't dramatize. They spoke about science, about process, about standards that hadn't existed in 1993 but did now. They explained how the evidence had been preserved, why it mattered that it had been untouched for years, sealed and forgotten rather than mishandled. DNA, they reminded the court, does not age the way memory does. It does not reinterpret itself. The judge took notes, face unreadable. Motions were taken under advisement. No decisions yet. Just another delay layered onto a case already defined by waiting. Outside the courtroom, the victim's family sat together, close but not touching, as if physical contact might shatter the fragile composure they had built over decades. They had learned how to survive without answers. Now they were being asked to survive with them. The difference was sharper than they expected. Hope, it turned out, was heavier than despair. Across town, the suspect's relatives avoided the news entirely. Some refused to believe the charges. Others believed but said nothing. Loyalty and denial blurred together, indistinguishable after so many years. They remembered a younger man, a brother, a son, a version of him that existed before the headlines. The justice system had a way of flattening identities, reducing lives to their worst alleged moment. That reduction cut both ways. Investigators used the lull to prepare for what came next. They rehearsed testimony, anticipating every angle of attack. Why wasn't this lead followed sooner? Why did this witness wait decades to come forward? Why should a jury trust evidence collected by people who were no longer alive to defend their methods? Each question had an answer, but answers weren't enough. They had to be understood. One detective revisited an old interview transcript late one night, a detail suddenly nagging at him. A pause. A hesitation in a witness's response that hadn't seemed important at the time. Now, with the suspect identified, it took on new meaning. He cross-referenced it with a timeline, then with a map. The alignment wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to be plausible enough to introduce reasonable certainty. He flagged it for discussion. Cold cases rarely hinge on a single revelation. They close because of accumulation. The lab results continued to hold. Independent verification confirmed the DNA match again. The probability numbers were staggering, the kind that defense attorneys hate because they sound abstract but land hard. 1 in billions. One profile. One source. No contamination. No ambiguity. The science stood firm, unmoved by rhetoric. The judge's ruling came days later. The evidence would stand. The case would proceed to trial. The defense's objections were noted, preserved for appeal but denied. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced. This wasn't victory. It was permission to continue. Trial dates were set. Jury selection loomed. The media cycle reignited, speculation sharpening into prediction. Some outlets framed it as redemption for law enforcement. Others questioned the ethics of prosecuting a man so long after the fact. Few remembered to center the victim beyond her photograph, frozen at the age she would never outgrow. The detective returned home late that night, exhaustion settling into his bones. He poured a drink he didn't finish, sat in the dark longer than necessary. Solving a case didn't feel the way people imagined. There was no release, no clean ending. Just the next obligation, the next preparation, the next reminder that justice was a process, not a moment. Jury selection began under tight scrutiny. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their exposure to the case, their opinions on DNA evidence, their ability to separate emotion from fact. Many were dismissed. Too informed, too biased, too hesitant. Eventually, 12 were chosen, along with alternates, each carrying their own invisible histories into the box. Opening statements were scheduled. The courtroom filled to capacity. The victim's family arrived early, taking their seats quietly. The suspect entered under guard, suit pressed, demeanor controlled. He avoided looking back. The judge gave instructions, voice steady, procedural. The room held its breath. The prosecution stood first. They didn't promise drama. They promised evidence. They spoke about a young woman who never made it home, about a community that searched and waited and mourned without answers. They explained how science had finally illuminated what time had hidden. Their words were deliberate, paced to guide rather than overwhelm. The defense followed, planting seeds of doubt with careful restraint. They acknowledged the tragedy without conceding guilt. They emphasized the years, the missing witnesses, the fallibility of human systems. They reminded the jury that certainty was rare, and that the burden rested entirely on the state. Then the witnesses began. Experts testified first, laying the foundation. DNA analysts explained protocols, charts displayed probabilities, chain of custody logs were introduced and dissected. The defense cross-examined aggressively, probing for weakness. None appeared. The science remained unshaken, clinical and indifferent. Next came the witnesses from the past. The man who remembered the scratched hands. The co-worker who recalled the sudden departure. Their voices trembled as they spoke, not from fear, but from the weight of memory long suppressed. The defense challenged their timelines, suggested suggestion, the influence of media. The witnesses held, imperfect but sincere. Photographs were shown. The road. The car. The evidence bags. Each image pulled the jury deeper into a story that refused to stay buried. The victim's family looked away when they needed to. They had learned how. Throughout it all, the suspect remained still. Occasionally he whispered to his attorney. Occasionally he stared straight ahead, jaw tight. No outbursts. No visible cracks. Guilt, innocence, denial, none of it readable on his face. As the days passed, the courtroom settled into a rhythm. Testimony. Objection. Sustained. Overruled. Recess. the machinery of justice grinding forward, powered by facts and interpretation. One afternoon, the prosecution introduced the final piece of physical evidence, the connection point, the moment when the abstract became personal. The jury leaned forward. Even the defense paused, recalibrating. This was the risk of cold cases. When they work completely. The day ended without conclusion. The judge dismissed the jury, instructed them not to discuss the case. People filed out slowly, tension trailing behind them like static. Outside, the sky darkened. The city moved on, unaware that history was being rewritten behind stone walls. The detective lingered, watching the courthouse empty. He thought about the night of the crime, the unanswered phone calls, the years of silence. The case was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was about what society does when the past refuses to stay quiet. About whether truth delayed still carried weight. Tomorrow the trial would continue. And with it, the steady march toward an ending that had been 30 years in the making. The verdict did not end the story. Cracked it open. In the days that followed, the courthouse emptied, the cameras moved on, and the headlines shrank into archives. But inside the town the past began to breathe again. Conversations lowered in grocery aisles. Old names resurfaced at kitchen tables. People who had not spoken in years suddenly remembered exactly where they were in 1993, what they were wearing, who they were afraid of. A solved cold case does not bring silence. It creates an echo chamber, and every sound inside it feels louder than before. The detective returned to his desk the morning after the verdict with a sense of unease he could not name. The file was closed, stamped, shelved. By every official measure, the job was done. Yet his hands hesitated over the keyboard. He had learned over decades that justice on paper does not always align with peace in reality. The past, once disturbed, rarely settles where you expect it to. Requests began to arrive almost immediately. Journalists asking for follow-ups. True crime producers circling like vultures, hungry for angles, for untold details, for emotional cracks they could widen. The detective declined most of them. This was not entertainment to him. This was a wound that had finally stopped bleeding, and he was not interested in reopening it for ratings. But some calls he could not ignore. A former witness left a message late one night, voice trembling, apologizing for what she had never said. Another man emailed from out of state, claiming he had information that might matter now. These were not tips about the convicted killer. These were confessions of silence. People coming forward not with evidence but with guilt. The case had been solved, but the moral debris it uncovered was still falling. The detective began keeping a notebook again. Not officially. Not for the department. For himself. Names. Dates. Regrets. He wrote down patterns he noticed. Fear. Youth. Power imbalance. How many people had known something was wrong, but had convinced themselves it wasn't their place to speak? Cold cases are not just about perpetrators. They are about environments that allow harm to pass unnoticed, unchallenged. The victim's family retreated from public view. They had given everything they could to the process, and now they were empty. Closure, they learned, is not a door that slams shut. It is a hallway that grows quieter over time. The sister stopped answering messages. The surviving relatives sold the old house. Photographs were packed away, not because they hurt too much, but because they finally felt heavy enough to rest. One afternoon, the detective drove past the original crime scene. No tape. No markers. Just asphalt and weeds. Children rode bikes nearby, unaware of what had once stained the ground beneath their tires. He sat in his car and listened. Traffic. Wind. Life continuing. The most unsettling thing about solved cases is how ordinary the world looks afterward. Inside the prison walls, the convicted man began his own slow unraveling. The bravado he had carried for decades evaporated within weeks. Guards reported sleepless nights, long stares, a sudden interest in religion, then a sudden rejection of it. He asked for books on forensic science, then stopped reading them halfway through. He wrote letters he never sent. The past, which he had buried so carefully, now followed him into every locked room. Psychologists evaluated him, searching for insight, remorse, explanation. He gave them fragments. He blamed stress, alcohol, youth. He minimized. He deflected. True accountability remained just out of reach. The The system does not require understanding to function. It requires proof. And proof had already done its work. The detective was asked to speak at a training seminar months later. Young officers filled the room, notebooks open, faces eager. He told them about patience, about evidence preservation, about listening to victims even when the trail goes cold. But what held their attention most was when he spoke about time. How it erodes confidence. How it reshapes memory. How it punishes inaction more brutally than mistakes. He did not tell them that some nights he still dreamed about the case. About walking through fog, chasing a shadow that never turned around. He did not tell them that solved cases can haunt you just as much as unsolved ones, because answers arrived too late to save anyone. New technology continued to advance. Other cold cases reopened. DNA databases expanded. Families who had lost hope found it again in sterile lab reports and long-delayed phone calls. The detective watched from a distance, proud but cautious. Each solved case carried celebration and sorrow in equal measure. Justice always came with a bill. In the community, narratives shifted. The man once seen as harmless was now reclassified in memory as dangerous, suspicious, obvious in hindsight. People rewrote their own pasts to accommodate the new truth. It was easier that way. Admitting ignorance felt safer than admitting awareness. The victim's name appeared on a memorial plaque downtown. Added quietly without ceremony. No speeches. No crowd. Just engraved letters catching the light in the afternoon sun. Someone left flowers once. Then again. Then it became a habit. Small rituals forming where none had existed before. Late one evening, the detective received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page. No accusations. No threats. Just a sentence written in careful handwriting. Thank you for not giving up when everyone else did. He folded it and placed it in his notebook, the final entry. Not because the case was over, but because he needed a place to stop. Cold cases teach a brutal lesson. Time does not heal. Preserves. It waits. And when the truth finally surfaces, it does not arrive gently. It arrives with force, demanding to be acknowledged by everyone it touches. The Michigan 1993 cold case was no longer a question mark in a filing system. It was a scar in a town's collective memory, proof that the past is never truly past. And somewhere between the silence that followed the crime and the noise that followed the verdict, a simple fact remained. The truth had been there all along, patient, unblinking, waiting for someone willing to listen long enough to hear it. The months after the conviction settled into an uneasy rhythm, the kind that looks like normal life from the outside but feels permanently off balance from within. The town woke up every morning knowing the cold case was no longer cold, yet nothing about daily routines had changed. Coffee still brewed. Factory whistles still blew. Snow still fell in the same dull sheets over cracked sidewalks. But beneath that surface calm, something restless moved, an undercurrent of questions that refused to stay quiet. At night, talk radio filled the airwaves with callers who claimed they had always suspected the truth, who swore they remembered something strange, something wrong, something they should have said. Memory became elastic, stretching backward, reshaping itself to fit the verdict. Psychologists call it retrospective clarity. The detective called it human survival. People need to believe they would have acted differently if they had known then what they know now. But the truth is harsher. Most people don't act because certainty is rare, fear is common, and doubt is comfortable. The prosecutor returned to her office the week after sentencing and found the shelves still lined with unopened files. Other cases waited. Other victims demanded attention. She felt the weight of expectation heavier now. Solving a decades-old cold case does not buy peace. It raises the bar. Every unsolved file becomes an accusation. Every unanswered death feels louder. She worked longer hours, driven by a quiet panic that time might run out again. She replayed the confession often in her head. Not the words themselves, but the pauses between them. Those gaps spoke louder than the statements. Silence has a texture when you've listened to it long enough. She wondered how many truths lived inside those gaps. Truths that would never make it into any transcript. Across the state, families of other victims began calling the detectives unit. They referenced the Michigan 1993 cold case as proof that hope was not foolish. They asked about DNA, about witnesses, about reopening files sealed by dust and disappointment. Each call carried desperation, and he felt it settle into his bones. He answered carefully. Honestly, not every case can be saved. Not every ending comes with justice. But sometimes enough patience can crack even the hardest silence. The convicted man's former friends watched the coverage in fragments, never all at once. A headline here, clip there. No one wanted to sit through the full story. Doing so meant confronting their own proximity to the truth. Some denied ever knowing him well. Others insisted he had changed, that the person on the screen was not the man they remembered. Distance became a defense mechanism. The farther away they placed him in memory, the safer they felt. In prison, the man aged quickly. Stress carved lines into his face deeper than time ever had. He requested meetings with counselors, then canceled them. He began recounting his life to anyone who would listen, searching for a version of himself that made sense. Sometimes he expressed remorse, other times resentment. He blamed the town for turning on him, the justice system for waiting too long, the victim for being in the wrong place. Accountability flickered, never fully igniting. One night during a routine cell check, a guard heard him whispering to himself. Not praying, not ranting, rehearsing. The same phrases again and again, like he was still trying to convince an invisible audience. Guilt does not always scream. Sometimes it mutters. Back in the community, the school where the victim had once studied quietly updated its records. A counselor suggested a moment of remembrance during an assembly. The idea was debated, postponed, softened. People feared reopening wounds, but the wounds had never closed. Eventually, a brief acknowledgement was made. No details. Just a name. Just a year. The students listened politely, unaware they were inheriting a piece of unresolved history. The detective attended that assembly from the back of the room. He watched the faces of teenagers who had not been born when the crime occurred. To them, 1993 sounded ancient, almost fictional. And yet, the consequences of that year shaped the very streets they walked on. This, he thought, is how trauma moves forward. Not through stories told loudly, but through silence passed down quietly. Late one evening, he reopened his notebook. He had promised himself he was done, but something pulled him back. He wrote about patterns he could not ignore. How many cold cases involved victims who were easy to overlook? How often justice arrived only when technology advanced enough to compensate for human failure? Progress, he realized, was often an apology delivered too late. He began drafting a letter to the victim's family, then stopped. What could he say that hadn't already been said? Gratitude felt inadequate. Apologies felt hollow. He tore up the page and closed the notebook again. Media attention spiked once more when a documentary announced it would feature the case. Trailers promised revelations, unseen footage, shocking twists. The family declined participation. The detective declined interviews. The story would be told anyway. That is the cost of notoriety. Once a cold case becomes famous, it no longer belongs solely to those who lived it. When the documentary aired, viewers reacted strongly. Social media filled with outrage, sympathy, theories. Armchair detectives dissected timelines, questioned motives, proposed alternate suspects despite the conviction. The internet does not crave resolution. It craves engagement. The case became content stripped of its human weight, recycled for clicks. The prosecutor avoided watching it. She knew the facts. She had lived them. She did not need dramatic music to remind her of the cost. Meanwhile, an unexpected letter arrived at the courthouse. It was addressed simply, written in shaky handwriting. Inside, an elderly woman confessed to lying in 1993, claiming she had seen nothing when she had, in fact, seen a figure running from the scene. Fear, she wrote. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being wrong. She apologized, not asking for forgiveness, only to be heard. Legally, it changed nothing. Emotionally, it changed everything. The detective read the letter twice. Then a third time. This was the invisible toll of cold cases. The crime never truly ends. It ripples outward, touching lives decades later, demanding acknowledgement from those who once hid behind uncertainty. As winter deepened, the town prepared for the holidays. Decorations went up. Lights blinked against the dark. There was laughter again, cautious but real. Healing does not erase pain. It grows around it. The victim's family attended a small gathering, the first in years. They spoke her name without their voices breaking. Progress measured in inches. On the anniversary of the crime, there was no official event. Just quiet visits. Just candles left where asphalt met memory. The detective stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, watching the flames flicker. He thought about how long the truth had waited, about how close it had come to being buried forever, about how many other truths were still waiting. Cold cases are often described as puzzles, but puzzles imply intention, logic, a final picture waiting to be revealed. This was not a puzzle. It was a fracture. And fractures do not disappear when identified. They remain lines of weakness that remind you where the structure once failed. As the night deepened and the candles burned low, the town returned to its uneasy calm. The case was solved. The files were closed. But the echo remained, stretching across years, across lives, across the thin line between what we know and what we choose not to see. Time moved forward, but not cleanly. It dragged fragments of the past along with it, scraping them against the present until both were marked. Spring arrived late that year, hesitant, as if the town itself wasn't sure it deserved renewal. Snow melted into gray slush, revealing litter, cracks, and stains that winter had hidden. It felt symbolic. After the Michigan 1993 cold case was solved, nothing stayed buried for long. The courthouse returned to its routine hum, but the hallways felt different. Staff members spoke in measured tones, aware that their building had briefly become a crossroads of history. The prosecutor noticed it most in the eyes of junior attorneys. They watched her with a mixture of admiration and unease, as if her success had rewritten what was expected of them. Solving a cold case after 3 decades was no longer an anomaly. It was now a benchmark. She kept her office door closed more often. Inside, she reviewed transcripts not for strategy but for understanding. She searched the language of the confession, the rhythm of the statements, the places where certainty faltered. The law demands clarity, but human truth rarely provides it. She wondered whether justice had been served completely or simply sufficiently. That question had no legal answer. Across town, the detective received notice of his retirement date. A formality. A quiet acknowledgement that his career was nearing its end. Colleagues congratulated him, joked about fishing trips and quiet mornings. None of them mentioned the case, but it hovered between them anyway, unspoken. He had solved it, yes, but it had also solved him, defining the final chapter of his work. He began cleaning out his office. Old notebooks, yellowed photos, cassette tapes labeled in block letters. He paused over one photograph in particular, the original crime scene, captured in harsh flash. He had seen it 1,000 times, but now it looked unfamiliar, like an image from another life. He placed it back in the box, unsure whether keeping it was an act of respect or obsession. The victim's family experienced a different kind of reckoning. With the case resolved, the rhythm of grief changed. For years, their sorrow had been sharpened by uncertainty, by the constant hum of unanswered questions. Now those questions were gone, replaced by something heavier: finality. There would be no more updates, no more breakthroughs, no more hope of a different ending. The truth had arrived, and it was permanent. The sister found herself dreaming of moments she had forgotten. Small things. Shared jokes. The sound of laughter in the kitchen. The past felt closer now, almost reachable, and that closeness hurt more than the distance ever had. She began writing letters to her sibling, never intending to send them anywhere. Just words on paper, bridging decades that could never truly reconnect. In the wider community, the case altered how people spoke about crime. There was less certainty, more caution. Parents warned their children differently now, not with vague fears but with specific lessons about trust, about familiarity, about the danger that can hide behind routine. The town had learned, too late, that monsters do not always look like strangers. A local historian requested access to the case files for archival purposes. The request sparked debate. Was it preservation or exploitation? Education or intrusion? Ultimately, a limited version was approved, redacted, and delayed. History, like justice, moves slowly when it carries weight. The convicted man's appeals began quietly. Procedural challenges, claims of coercion, arguments about memory contamination. None of them gained traction. The evidence was too strong. the confession too detailed. Still, the process churned on. The legal system does not stop simply because the truth feels settled. It must be challenged, tested, reaffirmed. That is its nature. Inside his cell, the man grew increasingly isolated. Other inmates kept their distance, not out of fear but disdain. Crimes against the vulnerable carry their own hierarchy behind bars. He spent hours staring at the concrete wall, tracing invisible patterns with his fingers. The past replayed in fragments, not chronologically but emotionally. Guilt arrived without warning, then vanished just as quickly. One afternoon, he requested to speak with a chaplain. The conversation lasted less than an hour. When it ended, he returned to his cell and tore up the pamphlet he had been given. Redemption, it seemed, was another concept he could not fully grasp. The detective attended his retirement ceremony in a modest room with stale coffee and polite applause. Speeches were made. Plaques were handed out. When his turn came, he spoke briefly. He thanked his colleagues. He mentioned teamwork. He avoided specifics. But as he stepped away from the podium, he caught a glimpse of the victim's family seated quietly in the back. They nodded at him. Nothing more. Nothing less. It was enough. After retirement, the days stretched wide and unfamiliar. He woke early out of habit, then realized there was nowhere he needed to be. The absence of urgency felt unsettling. He took long walks, revisiting streets he had once patrolled. The town looked the same yet entirely different. Every corner held a memory, every shadow a reminder. He considered writing a book. Many had suggested it. He dismissed the idea quickly. Some stories are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be remembered carefully, handled gently, then left where they belong. The cold case continued to influence policy. Evidence storage protocols were updated. Training programs emphasized long-term thinking. The idea that a case could be solved decades later changed how law enforcement approached the present. Every piece of evidence now carried the weight of the future. At a regional conference, the prosecutor spoke about the case without naming it. She focused on patience, on humility, on the importance of revisiting assumptions. The audience listened intently. Many took notes. Few truly understood the emotional costs behind her words. Success stories rarely capture the sleepless nights that accompany them. Meanwhile, the town prepared for a memorial installation. Not a statue, not a plaque, something quieter. A bench in a small park facing a stand of trees. The victim's name engraved simply, without dates, without explanation. A place to sit, place to think. The family approved it unanimously. The unveiling was private. No press, no speeches. Just a handful of people standing in silence. Birds chirped overhead. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Life, indifferent and persistent, continued. The sister placed her hand on the bench and closed her eyes. For the first time in 30 years, she felt something close to peace. As summer approached, the case began to fade from headlines. New scandals emerged. New tragedies demanded attention. The world moved on as it always does. But in Michigan, in that small town shaped by a crime that waited decades to be named, the past had altered the future irrevocably. Cold cases are often framed as battles against time. But time is not the enemy. Complacency is. Silence is. The belief that unanswered questions will somehow resolve themselves if left alone. The Michigan 1993 cold case proved otherwise. It waited. It endured. And when it finally spoke, it demanded to be heard by everyone it touched. The echo remained, softer now but still present. A reminder that truth does not expire. It does not fade. It waits, patient and unforgiving, until someone is willing to listen long enough to let it surface. Autumn arrived with a sharper edge, the kind of cold that slips under coats and settles into the bones. Leaves piled against curbs, brittle and loud underfoot, announcing every step like an accusation. The town had learned to live with the solved cold case, but living with it did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying it quietly, letting it influence decisions in ways that were rarely spoken aloud. The park bench became a place people visited without explanation. No one lingered too long. They sat, stared at the trees, breathed, then left. The name etched into the metal did not demand attention, but it drew it anyway. Teachers stopped there after work. Parents paused while pushing strollers. Even teenagers, restless and distracted, sometimes slowed when they passed, sensing gravity without understanding its source. The detective noticed it on one of his walks. He stood at a distance, watching strangers interact with a memorial he had never imagined would exist. This was the afterlife of a cold case, he realized. Not headlines, not courtrooms, but small unscripted moments of recognition, the past slipping into the present without ceremony. He had begun receiving letters from across the country, other retired officers, former prosecutors, families still waiting. They wrote to him not because they expected miracles, but because his case had reopened a door they thought was sealed. He answered some. Others he set aside, not out of indifference but respect. He knew the danger of offering hope where certainty did not exist. The prosecutor faced her own reckoning. Success had placed her in a spotlight she had never sought. Political conversations followed. Suggestions. Opportunities. She listened politely and declined most of them. Power, she had learned, often distances you from the very people you once served. She preferred proximity. She preferred knowing names. In her quieter moments she thought about the confession again. Not the words but the timing. Why then? Why after so many years? Was it guilt finally outweighing fear? Or simply the exhaustion of carrying a lie for decades? The law does not require motive for truth-telling, but the human mind craves explanation. She accepted she might never fully understand it. The convicted man's health began to deteriorate as winter approached. Minor ailments at first. Sleeplessness. Loss of appetite. Then more serious concerns. Medical staff documented symptoms carefully, aware of the scrutiny that followed high-profile inmates. He refused pain medication some days, accepted it eagerly on others. Control in any form had become precious to him. He spoke less now. The rehearsed phrases had faded. What remained was silence, thick and constant. In rare moments of conversation, he hinted at other secrets, other wrongs, but never enough to form substance. Whether this was manipulation or confusion was unclear. Some men carry their truths to the grave not out of defiance, but habit. The victim's family continued rebuilding their lives in small, deliberate ways. Holidays were still difficult, but no longer unbearable. The sister hosted a gathering for the first time since the trial. It was modest, quiet, familiar faces. Laughter came unexpectedly, startling everyone, then settling into the room like a guest no one had dared to invite before. They spoke about the past without whispers. About childhood. About mistakes. About the years lost to waiting. Grief had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It no longer dominated every conversation. It shared space with memory, with warmth, with the possibility of joy. In town council meetings, discussions about safety took on new urgency. Lighting upgrades. Community patrols. Support programs. Some criticized the changes as performative, too late to matter. Others argued that prevention is never too late. The truth sat somewhere in between. You cannot undo harm, but you can refuse to repeat it. The case began appearing in academic journals, stripped of emotion, reduced to data points and procedural lessons. Evidence handling, witness reliability, the impact of delayed justice. Scholars debated its implications, citing it as an example of both systemic failure and eventual success. The detective read one such article and closed it halfway through. It felt incomplete, like reading an anatomy chart without ever meeting the patient. A local journalist, younger than the case itself, attempted a long-form piece about the town's transformation. She interviewed shop owners, teachers, clergy. Most spoke cautiously, choosing words that revealed little. Trauma teaches discretion. When she approached the detective, he declined politely. Some stories, he believed, lose their truth when over-explained. Winter returned with heavier snow, muting the streets. The bench disappeared beneath white drifts, the engraved name hidden but not erased. Someone brushed it off regularly. No one knew who. It became an unspoken agreement. The memorial would not be allowed to vanish, even temporarily. The prosecutor received news that one of her earliest mentors had passed away. At the funeral, surrounded by colleagues from different eras, she reflected on the cyclical nature of justice. How each generation inherits the unresolved work of the last. How some battles span careers, even lifetimes. The Michigan cold case had been one such battle. One perhaps, but at a cost that would echo long after she was gone. In prison, the convicted man was hospitalized briefly. Rumors circulated online, speculation feeding on uncertainty. Some hoped he would live long enough to fully confront his actions. Others hoped the opposite. Justice, they argued, had already been served. Anything more was unnecessary. The debate revealed more about public appetite for punishment than about the man himself. The detective avoided the noise. He had learned that public opinion is a shifting landscape, shaped by emotion and distance. What mattered was quieter. The family sleeping better. The town speaking more honestly. The lesson embedded into institutional memory. One evening, as snow fell steadily, he walked past the old crime scene again. Streetlights cast halos through the flakes. He stood there longer this time, hands tucked deep into his coat. For years, this place had been a question mark. Now it was an answer. Not a comforting one, but a complete one. That, he realized, made all the difference. He thought about the younger version of himself, standing in the same spot decades earlier, uncertain, overwhelmed, unaware of how long the road ahead would be. If he could speak to that man now, he would not offer reassurance. He would offer patience. The kind that endures ridicule, doubt, and time itself. As the year drew to a close, the case faded further into history. Not forgotten but filed away in the collective mind. The bench remained. The name remained. The lessons remained. Cold cases do not truly end when they are solved. They transform. They move from mystery to memory, from urgency to warning. The town entered the new year quietly. No countdown. No celebration tied to the past. Just a collective breath taken together, as if acknowledging survival. The Michigan 1993 cold case had waited 30 years to be heard. Now, heard at last, it asked only one thing in return: that no one pretend it never happened. And in the silence that followed, heavy with snow and reflection, that promise held. The new year arrived without ceremony, slipping in quietly the way truth sometimes does when it no longer needs permission. January brought hard cold and clear skies, the kind that sharpen every sound and make even familiar streets feel exposed. The town moved forward, but it did so carefully now, as if aware that history was not something behind them, but something that walked alongside, close enough to touch. The Michigan 1993 cold case had settled into its final form, not as a headline, not as a courtroom victory, but as a permanent reference point. People spoke about time differently after it. About patience. About consequences. About the danger of assuming silence means resolution. The case had rewired the collective instinct, replacing complacency with caution. At the park, the bench remained a quiet anchor. Snow melted and returned, seasons passing over it like pages turning. The name etched into the metal darkened slightly with age, becoming part of the landscape rather than standing apart from it. That was how memory survived best. Not loud, not demanding, but present. The detective found himself visiting less often now. Not because it mattered less, but because it had finally found its place. He spent his mornings reading, his afternoons walking, his evenings listening to the radio out of habit. Occasionally, a news segment about a newly reopened cold case would catch his attention. He listened closely, noting the familiar language. Breakthrough decades later, shocking arrest. He felt pride, yes, but also a quiet ache. Each solved case was a reminder of how many remained unresolved. He received a call one afternoon from a young detective in another county. The man sounded nervous, respectful. He asked for advice. Not about evidence or procedure, but about endurance. About how to keep believing in a case when everyone else had stopped. The older detective paused before answering. Then he said the only honest thing he could. "You don't keep believing," he said. "You keep working. Belief comes later, if at all." The prosecutor transitioned into a new role within the department, one that focused on oversight and mentorship. She spent more time reviewing cases than arguing them. Some days she missed the clarity of the courtroom. Other days she welcomed the distance. She understood now that justice is not a moment, but a process that stretches far beyond verdicts and sentences. In meetings, she emphasized documentation, preservation, humility. She reminded young attorneys that confidence is useful, but curiosity is essential. That assumptions age poorly. That today's discarded lead might be tomorrow's revelation. Her colleagues listened. Some nodded. Some took notes. Whether the lessons would hold years later, she could not know. But she delivered them anyway. The victim's family marked the anniversary of the conviction privately. No media. No statements. Just a shared meal and a candle lit at dusk. They spoke about plans for the future trips, graduations, new beginnings. The absence was still there. A space no one could fill, but it no longer swallowed the room. Grief had become a companion rather than a captor. The sister returned to the bench alone one afternoon, long after the crowds had thinned. She sat and watched the trees sway gently in the wind. She thought about the years spent waiting, about the version of herself frozen in uncertainty. That person felt distant now, like someone she had once known but no longer was. She placed her hand on the cold metal and whispered goodbye, not to her sibling but to the waiting. In prison, the convicted man's appeals reached their final rejection. The last door closed without drama. No statements were issued. No protests followed. The system moved on. Inside his cell, the man reacted with a strange calm. Those who observed him noted the absence of anger. Resignation had taken its place. Whether this was acceptance or emptiness was unclear. He spent his days quietly, reading sporadically, writing occasionally. Some letters were sent. Most were not. The past no longer needed defending. It had already spoken. Whatever narrative he once controlled was gone, replaced by records, transcripts, and a truth that no longer required his participation. Academically, the case continued to circulate as a reference point. Seminars discussed it. Training manuals cited it. It became an example, a cautionary tale about delayed justice and the power of persistence. Yet stripped of faces and voices, it lost something essential. The human cost resisted reduction. Those who had lived it knew that no footnote could capture 30 years of not knowing. The town experienced subtle changes. Trust rebuilt slowly, unevenly. Some relationships never recovered. Others strengthened unexpectedly. People learned who they could rely on when things went wrong. They learned, too, that systems fail not because of malice alone, but because of neglect, fear, and fatigue. One evening during a community forum about safety and accountability, an elderly man stood up to speak. His voice shook, but his words were steady. He admitted that he had once dismissed concerns, told himself it wasn't his place. He apologized, not to anyone in particular but to the room. There was no applause. Just silence. Then someone nodded. Then another. That was enough. The detective heard about the forum later. He smiled faintly. Accountability does not always arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes it surfaces in moments like that, imperfect, incomplete, but real. As spring approached again, the town looked healthier. Gardens returned. Windows opened. Life asserted itself with quiet determination. The bench remained, now surrounded by green instead of white. Children climbed nearby trees, unaware of the weight carried by the place. That was not a failure of memory. It was proof of survival. The Michigan 1993 cold case had run its course. From violence to silence, from silence to truth, from truth to consequence. Its arc was long, uneven, and costly. But it had reached an end that few had believed possible. Yet endings are deceptive. They suggest finality where there is only continuation. The case ended, but its influence did not. It lived on and changed procedures, altered instincts, softened grief, and sharpened vigilance. It lived on in the understanding that time does not absolve, and that waiting is not the same as healing. On one of his last walks through town before moving closer to family, the detective paused at an intersection and looked around. Nothing marked the spot. No sign. No plaque. Just an ordinary corner. He realized then that this was the true measure of justice. Not that places become sacred, but that they become safe again. He turned and walked on, leaving the town to its future. Behind him, the past remained where it belonged. Not buried, not erased, but acknowledged. Cold cases end not with closure, but with acceptance. Acceptance that the truth arrived late. That it still mattered. That it changed something. And in the quiet that followed, heavy with years and lessons learned the hard way, the story finally rested. Not forgotten, not forgiven, but understood.